Hi, everybody. Welcome to our pop-up So What Happens Live. I'm Vanessa, and today we're going to talk about twin needles, one of my favorite things to use. If you have questions, please type them in the chat. I have Meredith and Wendy both here today to help answer questions, so let's get started. First of all, what is a twin needle? Here on you can see a bunch of twin needles, and really all a twin needle is two needles with one shaft. So it has one insert that goes into your machine just like a normal needle does, but then it has two needles that come off of it. And you can use a twin needle on any Pfaff sewing machine. As long as your machine does more than a straight stitch, you can use a twin needle. So they come in a lot of different sizes. There's a lot of variation. So you can kind of see here that we have from a 1.6 to a 6.0. And that number indicates the spacing in between the two needles. So you can definitely see a difference between that 1.6 distance between the two needles and the 6.0 distance. And that does affect what you're doing. So as we go along today, I'll talk about, what size needle or what spacing you might want to use for the technique that you're doing. So another question that most people have is, how do I thread? So I'm going to switch over here to the machine. I am on the Creative Icon too, because that's what I have here at home. But like I said, you can use the twin needles on any machine. You are going to need two spools of thread. So all of your machines should have two spool pins. Now, if you have an older machine, it may not pop up like these do. It may be an insert that you have to put in, but you should all have two spool pins. Some of your machines, one is going to be laying down in the horizontal position like that, and one is going to be standing up. It doesn't really matter. It's going to work whichever way your machine has them. Now, you can use two spools of thread, but sometimes when you're doing twin needle work, you might not actually have two spools of the same color thread if you're trying to use the same color, because you wouldn't have to. So sometimes what I do is I will wind on a bobbin and just put the bobbin up there. That way I don't have to have two complete spools of thread. So that works either way. And then the second thing with the threading is you thread it exactly the way you normally thread it. There's really no difference in the threading. So I thread one at a time, but you're going to thread them through the same thread path, both threads through the same thread path. No difference there. The one caveat is, unfortunately, you cannot use the automatic needle threader when you have twin needles in. So you got to thread it by hand, which is challenging. So the other thing that I want to show you, which is a fantastic feature on most of your Pfaff machines. Now, depends on how old your machine is or what version it is. Some of you may not have this, but I'm going to switch over to the machine again, lower the camera a little bit because I want you to see the screen. And one of the things that you have is in settings. So where your settings lives may be different on your machine than it is on my Creative Icon too, but you do have a settings tab. And in here, there is a section called Stitch Limiting Options. Okay, is that showing up on the camera? Bring that down a little bit more. Okay, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So I have stitch limiting options here. Let me bring it up. It's right here. And you're going to have this in your settings menu. And you have a couple things that you can choose in here. Stitch width safety, which really is if you were using your 1/4-inch piecing foot, which is a single hole foot, or if you have the straight stitch needle plate on. Then you see twin needle. So we can turn it off, or we can select the size needle that we're using. So that's, again, where it's really important to pay attention to what size needle, that distance between the two needles. It's going to tell you on your package. Don't lose your packaging because it's a little harder to tell if you don't have the package. So what I have in my machine right now is the 2.0. So that's what I have selected, but you would select whichever size you're using. And then the really cool thing, because when you're doing twin needles, if you think about it, when you're doing anything that's not a straight stitch, your needle is swinging from side to side, right? As it makes that pattern, whichever one you've chosen. So your stitch width has to be reduced a little bit so that one of those needles isn't hitting your foot and causing the needle to break. So your machine does all that thinking for you. So when you put in that you're doing twin needles and what size needle you're doing, look on the screen. I have the straight stitch selected and you can see what it's going to look like. If I go to a different stitch, and I'm just going to pick a different stitch here so that you can see what something different would look like. There you can see what that stitch, so it does the math for you. It automatically reduces that stitch width for you so that you don't have to think about it at all. I love that aspect of our Pfaff sewing machines. Wendy or Meredith, do we have any questions yet?
Not yet.
Okay. All right. So then let's talk about what do I do with twin needles? Why would I want to use those? So the first thing, and probably one of the most common things that we do with twin needles, is hemming. So here, this is a stretch fabric. And the nice thing about hemming on a stretch fabric is you retain that stretch when you do it with twin needles versus when you do it with a single needle. On the front side, you get that same look that you have on your ready-made t-shirts, things like that. On the back side, it's almost like it's a zigzag stitch in between those two rows. And that's really what allows that stretch to still happen when you use knit fabric. Very similar to what you would get if you did a cover stitch on a serger. So that's on stretch fabric, but think about like your jeans are also hemmed that way, right? So you oftentimes have that double row of stitching. And that double row of stitching, when you're using a twin needle, it means you don't have to go back and do a second pass and try to keep all of your spacing perfect. It's going to stay perfect for you because of using those twin needles. Another thing I like to use it for is top stitching. So you can see on here the top stitching, and this one is a pretty wide top stitch. So, again, it's just thinking about the look that you want. So this one, I can tell actually used the 6.0 twin needle for that top stitching. So it's going to give you a much more professional finish on your garments. Now let's look at something a little bit more fun. So one of my favorite things to do is decorative stitching. And what I want to show on here is the size needle that you choose is definitely going to affect the look of that decorative stitch. So if we look at this wave stitch up here, the first one, so this one right here, I did with a 2.0 spaced needle. This is a 3.0. This one's a 4.0, and then a 6.0. So if you have multiple sizes of twin needles, you might want to just do a little bit of testing to see which one you like the look of the best, because it does affect the spacing in between them. And really basic stitches can actually look really cool when you use a twin needle. So the zigzag stitch here, this is twin needle as well. Again, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, and 6.0. So if you look at the 2.0, you almost, it looks like a different decorative stitch than a zigzag. By the time you get farther apart up here where I used a 6.0, it does look more like 2 rows of a zigzag stitch. Down here, they're so close together that they kind of intertwine, which can be a really cool effect. Here's some of our other decorative stitches. And even something like a blind hem stitch. So here's the blind hem stitch done just with 1 needle. And then here we see it with 2 needles. So it now looks much more decorative than it does utilitarian. Same with the zigzag. So here you see the zigzag by itself and then a zigzag with twin needles. And on these, I used 2 different colors of thread. So that just gives me more texture. It gives me a different look. Down here, we have just a regular straight stitch. I use the reinforced straight stitch because it's a little bit heavier. It shows up a little bit better. And then again, did it with twin needles in 2 colors. Here we have some decorative stitches. And again, in yellow, you see what it would be like with just 1 needle, and then how different it looks when you do it with 2 needles. So really fun ways to use your decorative stitches. Got one more here with some decorative stitching on it. And you can do, again, use 2 different colors and get that kind of an effect. Or you can use the same color and it really makes it look like a whole different decorative stitch than what would be if you just used 1 needle. And then here on some of these satin stitches, it's hard to see it on camera, but it can give you a really cool effect. I think you can probably see it best on just the regular satin stitch. I actually used 2 shades of the same color. And so it almost gives you a shadowing effect. So some of these can also just make that stitch look bolder, look wider, and just give a totally different effect. Here's a denim jacket that has been embellished with decorative stitches using a twin needle. So in the middle, so this is all on the back of the jacket. In the middle, I've done 2 colors in the needle threads and made it, stitches that would be a little bit more prominent. And then on these side panels, I just did that wave stitch to add something to those. And then again on the front, just a basic decorative stitch, but using twin needles and 2 different colors of thread really makes them pop out. That is probably my favorite way to use twin needles. And now there's one more great use for twin needles. Do we have any questions yet?
We do, Vanessa, some very good ones. They would like to know what foot you are using with the twin needle. They also want to know, can you do a reverse to lock in the stitches or do a tie off with the twin needle? And are you using stabilizer?
Great questions. Most any time that I use decorative stitches, I do use stabilizer. And which stabilizer I use kind of depends on the project of what I'm doing, whether it can stay there, whether it needs to go away. but you're always going to get better results with your decorative stitches if you use some kind of a stabilizer. So with stitches, it's different than when you're doing embroidery, right? So with stitches, it's a little bit more delicate. I like to use what we call the stitch and ditch, which is more of a paper stabilizer because it tears away very easily. But you could also use like a tearaway light, or you could use an Aqua Magic and let it, a water soluble, and let it dissolve when you wash it. So it kind of just depends on the application. When I'm hemming something though, and I'm just using that plain straight stitch, I don't use a stabilizer. And then as far as the feet that I use, I like to use an open toe foot, or I really like the multi-line decorative foot if I'm doing decorative stitches and I'm doing multiple rows of them, so that I can use the lines on the foot in order for the spacing. So one of the things you want to remember, if you're doing regular straight stitching for top stitching, for hemming, you can use your standard foot. That's going to be fine. Anytime you're doing decorative stitches, usually your machine recommends that you use the foot that has the opening in the bottom. Okay, because that's going to slide over. Can you see that channel in there? That slides over the decorative stitches. So you have one that comes with your machine. You also have the option to purchase an open toe foot. The open toe just gives you more visibility because there's nothing that comes across there at the front. So both of those feet, if you have the Creative Icon 2 with projection, then doing multiple rows of stitching and lining them up, you can use that projection for that. So that's one of the great benefits of that projection, is anytime you're doing decorative stitches and you're trying to line things up, you have that projected line. But if you don't have that, then that multi-line decorative foot works great. Did I miss any questions?
No, you got them all.
Okay, good. All right. One other thing that you can do with a twin needle is pin tucks. So pin tucks really is taking little mini tucks in your fabric, and it creates texture. I think you can see on the camera how raised that is. All right. So this is just using a standard straight stitch and a pin tuck foot. So there are various pin tuck feet, and the difference between them is really the number of grooves that are in the bottom of the foot. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but can you see that there's a bunch of grooves on the bottom of the foot there? So there's a 5, there's a 7, and there's a 9. And that's how many grooves are in the bottom of that foot. And all you're doing is, I'll show it again on a solid fabric. It might be a little bit easier to see. When you're using that foot, the grooves help you keep a straight line. So your first pin tuck is, you're just going to sew and it's going to create that pin tuck. There's like a channel in the bottom of those grooves, and it kind of sucks that fabric up in there so that it's making that little tuck. When you do your second one, your spacing is determined by which one of those grooves you put your first stitch into. So these right here, I did really close together. So I'm using like the next groove on my foot in order to guide that, and it stays nice and straight. If we look at these over here, which are further apart, I actually used the edge of the foot as my guide and did another row of stitching. But either way, you can adjust your spacing when you're doing those, which just can create some fun looks. Like on this one, I did like 2 pin tucks close together and then I did a space, and then 2 pin tucks close together and then I did a space. So you can create some different effects there. You can even do cross hatching, so you're going in different directions. So it doesn't even have to all be the same direction. And again, it's a little hard to see on camera, but this does have a lot of texture to it because it has raised those areas up. It's not flat. And a fun thing, now you may be thinking, what would you use pin tucks for? It's kind of an heirloomy technique that we don't see a lot of today if you're not making little girl clothes or little baby clothes with a lot of pin tucks in them. But this is a fun, more modern way to use pin tucks. So if you see on here, each one of my petals is a different style of pin tuck. So that one's just straight, close together. And then on this one, you can see I've got some spacing in there. So I did like 3 pin tucks close together and then a space. On this one, I actually used that wavy stitch. Instead of doing a straight stitch, I used the wavy stitch. So that was really fun. You can also use the zigzag stitch. We can see it on this one. I used the zigzag stitch. And then the center of my flower was the cross hatching. So really fun ways. This also has leaves on it. So I just couched down some rickrack and did leaves that are pin tucked as well. So that's a fun, more modern way of doing pin tucks. Any other questions?
Yes, Vanessa, there is one more. They're curious about, is there a width limit when using the twin needles? So for your stitches, do they need to be under a certain width?
Well, as long as you have a machine that has the settings where you choose the size, it's going to automatically do the math and change the width for you. So you don't really have to think about it. You're going to see on your screen what that stitch looks like at that width. If you don't have a machine that has the twin needle in settings, then you want to hand turn your wheel a full cycle for the repeat of that pattern to make sure it's not going to hit the side of the foot. Like I said, it's a straight stitch you're not going to have to worry about. But when you choose decorative stitches, if you don't have the twin needle in settings, then you want to make sure that you hand turn the wheel a full cycle of that pattern. So not just one down and one up. You got to go through that whole pattern to make sure that it's not going to hit the foot. And you just need to adjust your stitch width. Just minus it until you're good and it's not going to hit one of the sides of the foot. The other thing I want to mention with the pin tucks is the size needle you use is going to make a difference in your pin tuck. So usually the lighter weight the fabric, the closer together you want your needles to be. So if you were doing something, say, on organza or chiffon or something batiste, then I would probably go with the 1.6 or the 2.0. I wouldn't go any bigger than 2.0. If you're doing on regular like quilting cotton like I did, then you could go 2.0, 2.5 is probably okay. If you're doing any of a heavier weight fabric, you can go a little bit wider, but it doesn't draw it up quite as much on a heavyweight fabric as it does on a lightweight fabric. So test it. When you're doing the pin tucks, you can also increase your or your thread tension, and that will help draw it up some as well. So if you're trying to do it on anything that's a little bit heavier than, I would say, the quilting cotton, I would definitely increase my tension and just try it a couple times and see if you're getting the results that you want. All right. I hope you enjoyed a little brief, quick tour of twin needles. I always amazes me. A lot of people have never tried twin needles. So I encourage you to go get some and try them out. It's really fun. All right. Thanks, guys.